In this lecture, we're going to be exploring how visual artists led the creative charge for the LGBTQ plus culture's rights. As you're listening to this lecture, you should also have opened the posted lecture slides, because as you can see on certain slides, such as this one, there are links to YouTube videos. So what you'll need to do as you listen to this lecture, I'll cue you when you need to actually pause the lecture, then go to the lecture slides and hit the link for the recorded videos. So in this, what we're looking at and what we've already discussed is homosexuality and gender fluidity have appeared as subjects in art for over a millennium. However, for modern Western cultures, it wasn't until the later 20th century that artists could treat such themes overtly, often without fear of censorship, ostracism, or even arrest. As we've talked about, the tipping point in the modern gay liberation movement was the Stonewall riots in June of 1964. And with this, what we saw, again, we consider this the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement. And what we're seeing is artists and artwork that had formerly been suppressed or hidden, we're now seeing them not necessarily accepted more in public, but we're seeing them more in a public sphere. And often what we were trying to do, and artists were trying to do, was to humanize those who had been ostracized because of their sexual orientation. Again, at the time of the Stonewall riots, homosexuality was illegal in 49 states. Gays and lesbians were barred from working for the federal government, and police treated cross-dressing as a punishable crime. And that's what's going to eventually lead up to the beginning of the Stonewall riots. So what I would like you to do now is to pause this video and then stop and play the link that is in the lecture slides. And what we're going to be looking at here is this is called Hidden Histories of Queer Art. And it's a shorter video where it's going to be talking about how artwork, queer art, has existed. It has always existed. However, often it's been hidden away from public view, or what we're going to see in some works of art was that they were in works of art that were for the public. However, there were these kind of hidden or coded messages in them. So please, again, pause this video here and go watch the other video. Okay, you should be now back from watching the Hidden History of Queer Art. And some things I want you to consider after watching this is they brought up the point when we talked about artists such as Duncan Grant. Duncan Grant was the artist who they found a lot of his artwork literally hidden under his bed with notes of who to give it to. And so some things we need to examine is kind of this ethical question that a lot of these artists had their work hidden and they never intended them to be viewed by the public. However, now, with artists such as Duncan Grant, his work is literally being put in the museums and out in the public eye. And we have to ask ourselves, is this something that morally we should be doing as art historians and educators? And often the answer to that is we say is yes, because again, the reason a lot of these artworks, these histories were hidden was because they would not have been socially acceptable at the time and literally could have, resulted in the artists losing their job, their homes, their families, possibly even their lives. And what usually art historians are saying is that times now are not as they were then. And it's important that we look at these artworks, that we explore these histories, because otherwise they're going to remain hidden from us. Often history is told from the point, of the victor. And in most of Western world, especially the United States, that's been by mid to upper class white men. So it's important that we do look at these histories so we can understand a fuller story. Also, you're going to see where they talked about it, and they talked about the idea of the embargo. And I want you to think about, why did certain artists and even their families say, well, yes, we'll give you this information. However, you can't use it for 10 years, or you can't use it until 10 years after the artist's death. So I want you to think about that in relation to the video. All right, so we're going to look at a couple different sections in this video. We're going to start with pre-Stonewall, then we'll talk about after Stonewall, and then we're going to look at art being used as a political tool. So as we've already said, When we look at queer art, it has been a subject matter in art for over a millennium, but also it often had to be hidden or it had to use codes that only certain groups would understand. An example of this is a work by Caravaggio. Caravaggio, probably one of the most well-known of the Italian Baroque artists. His dates were 1573 to 1610, and his birth name is actually Michelangelo Merci. Caravaggio was the name of his hometown near Milan, but he was known as Caravaggio. Often he painted religious themes in his work, especially around the Catholic Reformation and ideas of salvation. However, he would switch them in a way that's usually not used. So an example would be his work, The Calling of St. Matthew. And this would be the moment where Jesus is going to St. Matthew and saying, come, follow me. And it takes place actually in a tavern. Caravaggio is a very interesting artist. He had a very violent temper and actually had to flee, I think it was Rome, for a while because he was wanted for murder. And in his work, he purposely moved away from Renaissance masters and he refused to emulate them in his work. Often we see a very dramatic use of light and shade, which is called chiaroscuro, in his artworks. And he used very realistic imagery in everyday settings in many of his works. So what we're going to look at here, this is his work titled Musicians, circa 1595, and it's an oil on canvas. So this was an early work that was commissioned and painted for Francesco Maria Bourbon del Monte, who was actually a Catholic cardinal. What we see in this, we see 4 young players. We see the young lute player. The lute is the stringed, almost guitar-like instrument, who's looking right back at us. And I want you to look how he is looking at the viewer. He's got this kind of seductive facial expression. The horn player we see in the background. The third figure with the back to us is the violin player. And then if you look at the fourth figure in the upper left, you can see he has wings and a quiver of arrows. So this is either Cupid, the Cupid or Eros, the god of love. And we see him picking at grapes. That's a reference to Bacchus, who is the god of wine and feasting. And again, what's interesting is when we look back at the horn player who's in the background, that's actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And he is also gazing back out at the viewer. Who would the viewer have been? Again, this was for the Catholic cardinal. And so art historians have often remarked on the homoerotic nature of this painting. There were some allegations that the cardinal was a homosexual, and we have pretty clear evidence that the artist Caravaggio was actually bisexual. And so many people believe that this may be a message literally from Caravaggio in the painting, from Caravaggio to the cardinal, to Del Monte, who actually was his lover. Another example of artwork from before Stonewall. This one's called The Fleet's Inn from 1934. And with the long history of homophobia in the Western world, a lot of times it didn't keep homosexuality out of art necessarily, but again, it drove artists to conceal their sexual preferences behind visual codes. And we see this in Paul Cadmus's work from 1934, The Fleet's Inn. What's interesting with this work caused a national scandal when it came out. However, it was because of the subject matter that was obvious in this. When we look at the painting and we look at the title, we're talking about a group of sailors who have been out to sea and have come back. And as you can see in the painting, they're having a good time. A lot of the sailors are cruising with different women. And so this caused a scandal because it was very obviously sexualized. However, what he also put in there is he has, other homoerotic messages within this. So the blatant heterosexual sexuality almost became a distractor, right? It almost was helped hide the homoeroticness in this. So when we look at it, if you look at the sailors, especially the sailors on the right, their pants are very, very tight, especially clinging around the buttocks area. And then over on the left, we see this very dapper gentleman in the suit with the red tie, the wavy blonde hair, and then the exchange of the cigarette. All of these were coded symbols. The man who's dressed in the red tie and the slicked back hair, with this transitional exchange for the cigarette, that was known as an indication of actually soliciting sex. And we can see the exchange is between the two men here. So why, again, this caused a scandal because it was so sexualized. It also has these other homoerotic messages in it that were often overlooked. Okay, and then at this point, I would like you to pause the video again and watch the next video I have linked. Here, this is dealing with some of that same topic, looking at secret languages of LGBTQ plus art. And what we're going to see in this is it's going to be a deeper look and a deeper exploration of how artists for centuries, for a millennium, put messages in the work that were using symbols and symbols to convey messages so they wouldn't be outright ostracized, but those who knew and understand the message and the meaning could fully explore the work. So please, again, pause at this moment and watch this video. All right, so you should be back from watching the video now, and I wanted to touch a little bit more on one of the topics that they talked about. And part of this was using subject matter that would otherwise be deemed acceptable for public viewing, but then also putting a bit of a spin on it. You heard them talk about Achilles and Patroclus. This is an example, this is an example of this in the painting. So Achilles and Patroclus, two very famous figures from Homer's The Iliad. They were raised, they're best friends, they were basically raised as brothers. And Achilles is a central figure of the Iliad. In fact, the Iliad is all about the rage of Achilles. And in it, Patroclus, his best friend, actually does die in the battle. And often there's these scenes of Achilles mourning Patroclus, and Patroclus' death is what eventually leads to Achilles to rejoining the war and eventually to the Greeks' victory. And often this subject has been the subject of many, many works of art. What you can see, though, is how what artists would do, they would take the subject matter that would be widely acceptable. However, they would create it in a way that maybe it's showing Achilles not as, here you see, lamenting the death of Patroclus, not as in a brother, mourning a brother, but as somebody with a closer, possibly even a more romantic relationship, mourning the death of a partner. So again, this would be considered publicly acceptable because we're talking about the scene from the Iliad. However, the relationship can change depending on the artist and how they use the work. Interestingly enough, this topic has definitely come to the forefront in the last couple years with the publication of the recent book called The Song of Achilles. And this is actually a retelling of the Iliad, and this is one where they do change the relationship from Achilles and Patroclus being more brothers to actually being partners. Other examples of artwork before Stonewall, this is by Francis Bacon, the artist, not the philosopher. Francis Bacon was notoriously kicked out of his parents' home when his father caught him trying on his mother's clothes. Now, he did not flaunt his homosexuality in public, but he also did not hide it in his art. Here, what we see is an example of one of his paintings. This is called Two Figures from 1953. And what we see is we can tell it's basically looks like two male characters, but it's very distorted, right? We have these fleshy images of new men, and they're literally laying on some sort, looks like of a bed together. It's very clearly erotic. However, because of it's so abstract, even as early in the 1950s, images such as this were more widely acceptable because it wasn't necessarily 100% clear what was going on. Another artist that was looking at ideas of gender identity and expression is the French artist and writer Claude Cahun, and they addressed their own gender ambiguity in very experimental photographs. And what Claude Cahun claimed is they said, "Neuter is the only gender that always suits me." They were well respected in surrealist circles in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. But their work really wasn't publicly exhibited until the 1990s. And this is when the academic and the art world would begin taking this very keen interest in Cahun's work and how they explored these different ideas of gender identity. And you'll see again more about Cahun in a later video. All right, now we're going to move on to after the Stonewall riots. So now we're in the time of the modern gay liberation movement. However, we also have to remember at this time in the 70s, this is also the time of the sexual revolution. And so what we're seeing is not only the queer community being more open and fighting for their rights, we're also going to see, especially the younger populations with the sexual revolution, fighting for more openness and acceptance of sexuality. So energized by the gay liberation movement and the growing sense of acceptance and community following the Stonewall Rebellion, artists in the 1970s and the 1980s depicted gay and lesbian and transgender subjects with unprecedented openness. We're seeing this in a way we've not seen in the art world before. From the article you were supposed to read, you see that one individual says, before the civil rights movement, it was illegal to even mail full frontal nude male images through the post. That changed. There was the sexual revolution and other developments that allowed these artists to be more openly gay and more openly sexual. And what we're going to see is photography is going to emerge as a particularly crucial vehicle for exposing and showing gay and lesbian visibility. We'll see artists such as Robert Mapplethorpe, Peter Hujan, Nan Golden, Bill Jacobson, Mark Morisseau, and Jack Pearson, to name a few. What they did was they turned their cameras to the queer community and the life unfolding around them. They were often documenting their own friends and lovers and the nightlife and showing a type of intimacy that we could not see before, that wouldn't be out for the public world. What we see in this is also a way of humanizing these individuals, that these individuals who had literally been criminalized for so many years, now what they're trying to do is show these are humans, these are people just like everybody else. What you see is there was a big drive to document gay and lesbian and transgender communities in subcultures and individuals, and the camera was there and easily able to do that. And you see that in the work that we see there. Here, a very open and honest look at, two men. We also see this in the work presented here. This is by Andy Warhol, and it's from his series titled America in 1985. And what he did with this series was literally he traveled around the United States, and he took these different Polaroid pictures. You have to remember, at the time, the Polaroid was very revolutionary. We're still in the era of film camera. So what you would have to do is you would take your images, they'd be on the film. You would then have to go take your film, develop the film, and then from the film, print those images. Well, with the invention of the Polaroid, this was a way that within minutes you could actually see what the image was. And with a Polaroid, side note, you're actually not supposed to shake Polaroid pictures. But the image we're looking at here, this is called Lance Loud, and again, it's from Warhol's series America from 1985. Lance Loud, we could kind of talk about him as being one of the first reality TV stars. He and his family were actually part of a 12-hour documentary on the American family. Literally, it was called An American Family. And the idea of this was to show, what the true American family was supposed to be like. Well, interestingly enough, during the show, the parents actually got divorced, and Lance, who was one of the children, came out as openly homosexual. And this actually spurned a natural controversy. What the show really shows is that this idea, this fantasy of the American family, as we see usually on TV, is completely false, and most families aren't actually like this. Lance then started the band The Mumps in 1978, and he gained some success. So he began to be seen, kind of as this rock star. And that's what we see in this image here. What we're seeing is this Polaroid capturing at this moment, and often, looking at the male figure this way as the rock star, the sexualized objects. This usually would be for the female gaze. However, what we see here is this is actually for the male gaze, again, based on his own homosexuality. What we see in most of Warhol's works are an expression of some sort of queerness, not only in the homosexual desire category, but thinking about things in a different and a new way. With him, nothing was off limits. Next, we're going to start exploring art being used as challenging gender identity. And what we're looking at is the idea of cross-dressing in this image and the next one. Cross-dressing is often a strategy for announcing that one's biological sex is not necessarily coinciding with one's gender identity. And we've talked a little bit about this before. When we're talking about biological sex, we're talking about the science. We're talking about the X's and Y chromosomes. When we talk about gender, right, again, gender is a social construct. It is something that has been created by society, and with gender comes certain expectations. You know, that little girls like pink and play with dolls, and boys like blue, and, you know, that idea of be a man. Well, what we're seeing in the next two works are two artists using their works to challenge those ideas. So what we're looking at here, the photograph was actually done by Man Ray, a very famous artist. And it's a photograph of Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp, again, also another very famous artist. He's the artist who created Fountain, which is the urinal. He did the ready-mades, where he took already made objects and reused them in a new way. Here, though, what we're seeing Marcel Duchamp as his alter ego, Eros C'est la Vie. Again, the name is a kind of play on words, where Eros or Cupid, depending on Greek or Roman, again, the god of love. And that c'est la vie basically means that's life in French. So even the name of this alternate personality, you know, is very intentionally shown. And what we're seeing here, we're seeing Duchamp cross-dressing. He's wearing a hat and the coat of a female friend of his, Jermaine Everling, and you can see he has makeup on. However, he's also challenging us. He's challenging us to question if what we are seeing here is reality. So we see him dressed as this alter ego, but take a minute and look at it, and you can see that something is off. So look at the hands. When you look at the hands, they are distinctly out of proportion from the rest of Duchamp. And in fact, these are not his hands. Jermaine Everling is actually standing behind him, and these are her hands in the photograph. So again, he's challenging us, right? This idea of the photography, that it's showing the world as it actually is. Again, here they're using it in a way to challenge that. Is what you see actually what you think you see? Another example of an artist using art to challenge gender identity. This is by Eleanor Anton, and it's from her series called The King of Sonola Beach that she did in the early 1970s. The photograph you're looking at is called My Kingdom is the Right Size from 1974. And what she did is she created this personage, right? And she called him the king. So not even only was it a male figure, but it was a strong and powerful male figure. And she would go out and she would explore the world. She would explore Sonola Beach as this character who was male. And she says what happens in it is that it allowed her to explore dimensions of her own self that might otherwise have remained hidden. She said the usual aids to self-definition, sex, age, talent, time, and space are merely tyrannical limitations upon my freedom of choice. And so by becoming the king character, she could explore the world in a way that was often closed off to her as a female. And so that's what we see in the image here. And she's actually that central figure with the hat, the long hair, and the beard. That's Eleanor Anton as the king. And then another artist who was using the art to challenge gender identity and also to help humanize those that were often ostracized. What we see is this is by Marietta Pathy Allen, and she was a photographer, and she spent more than 40 years photographing transgender individuals. She would photograph them going about their daily routines and their lives, and what she was trying to do was trying to personalize them and their struggle for equality, and help raise consciousness about gender nonconforming issues. And you can see that in the work here. This is Paula and daughter Rachel. And so when you look at this, when we look at the relationship between the two, we see Paula is a transgender individual. However, they have that relationship with their daughter. And you can see this is a very caring and open and loving relationship. And that's what Allen was trying to do, that she was trying to humanize the transgender community, who was often ostracized and definitely was othered. And she's trying to show in the work that these are individuals, right? These are individuals, these are people who deserve the same rights and respects as everyone else. All right, now I'm going to ask you to pause this video again and click on the link for the next video. This is going to be a video, it's about 15 minutes long, and again, it's going to be one where we're exploring ideas of gender and what gender is in art. And this is very interesting because we look at some modern pieces, however, they also go back and look at some much older and even ancient works where ideas of gender and gender nonconformity are explored in the works. All right, next we're going to look at art and artists using their works in part of political, often asking for political rights, often asking for political help from the government, and also bringing attention to communities. So what we're going to see is, we already talked about the rise of the modern gay liberation movement. Well, in the 1980s, what we're going to see is a reaction to both the gay liberation movement and the sexual revolution. And we're going to see the pendulum kind of swing back the other way. And we're going to see conservatism spread, especially because the religious right stepped up its attacks on anything that they deemed threatening to what they called traditional American values. And I want you to take a minute and think about, what does that mean? What are these traditional American values that they are claiming needed to be protected? And they're definitely saying that they needed to be protected from things such as homosexuality. What we see at this time is many artworks are going to take more of a political bend. Why? This is also when we have the AIDS epidemic. With the AIDS epidemic, some people saw this as, God's punishment on homosexuals, especially on gay men, because gay men were a large number of the individuals who had HIV that would eventually lead to AIDS. There was also this very real fear about HIV and AIDS. Why? Because we knew HIV spread very rapidly, and once you had HIV, eventually it would become AIDS, which was a death sentence. There were no treatments for it. And just like how COVID was, you don't die of AIDS, but you die of complications from it, basically because it destroys your immune system. And so often these deaths would be a result of long suffering illnesses. Also, part of the fear surrounding HIV and AIDS was, at first we didn't know how it was spread. We knew it very easily spread, but there was fear, such as, think of again COVID times, where there was a fear that, well, if somebody with AIDS touched something, if you touched it, could you possibly get it? Eventually, they discovered that it had to do with the exchange of bodily fluids. But again, there was even the fear that you were told not to go use a public restroom, because what if somebody who has HIV or AIDS peed on the seat and somehow you touched it, and is that going to get into your system? So there was this very real fear about how HIV and AIDS were spread. And what we see in this is that there was actually a lack of political action or response to the AIDS epidemic. In fact, Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, didn't even publicly say the word AIDS until 1985. And so at this time, I'd like you to pause and watch the video that's linked here. This is just a short video talking some about the AIDS epidemic at the time, and again, how some of the art world reacted to it. Right, and so you see how some artists were using their works for a call of action. And we see that here in Keith Haring's work called Ignorance Equals Fear from 1989. Haring, again, already a well-known artist for his figures. What we see in this work is he's making a play on that hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. And he's talking about the total inaction. And at the top, you can see ignorance equals fear. What are we often afraid of? We're afraid of things that we don't know and don't understand. And at the bottom where it says silence equals death, basically he's saying here that if we don't do anything, if we're not learning about this, if we're not talking about this, then you're literally leading to the death of certain individuals. In another work, this one was mentioned in the video. This is by Donald Moffat from 1987, and it's called He Kills Me. Moffat would actually become one of the founding members of the AIDS activist collection Grand Fury. And in this one, what they would do is it's literally talking about Reagan's in action. Here you see this smirking Reagan and the bullet, the bullseye on the image to the left, and then the words, "He kills me." What they would do with this is they literally would print these and they plastered them all over New York City. It's like billboards, street signs, benches, these were everywhere. And what they're doing is they're calling out the government's inaction, saying literally all these people are dying and you've not done anything. Again, Reagan didn't even say the word AIDS. I think the video said 1986. My research is showing 1985. And this was after 30,000 people had already died of AIDS. So those are some examples of directly political works. However, other works, other artists were trying to do was, again, to humanize those who were suffering from AIDS, and also not just those who were physically suffering from it, but also show the suffering of those who love them, their family, their friends, and their partners. And you see that in works such as this one here. This is by Hugh Steers, and it's called Hospital Bed from 1993, and it's an oil on canvas. And so when we look at this work, what we're seeing is we're seeing the two men in the hospital bed, the one very clearly suffering and dying of AIDS, while they're being held by the other figure. And we might see them, maybe they're brothers, maybe they're romantic partners, maybe they're just friends. But we can see not only the suffering of the one who is sick, but also the suffering of the one who is there trying to help them and assist them, and there's really nothing they can do. What we see in Steers' work is almost this Hopper-esque quality, looking at American regional artist Edward Hopper. His most famous work is Nighthawks. And what Hopper would often do in his works, he would talk about life in things such as the American city, and the idea that even while you're surrounded by so many people, there can still be this sense of isolation and loneliness. And that's what Steers is showing in his work here, that, why we see these two individuals, both of them are suffering, there's literally almost no one, not literally there's no one else around them. And so the idea of isolation and loneliness within the work. Another example of an artist. This is work by Eric Rhine, and it's called Leaves. And what he did was basically he was walking home, and I can't remember if it was walking home after someone had just died or if it was walking home after a funeral. And he talked about how he'd been to all of these, these funerals, all these friends were dying, and he picked up a leaf, and he was thinking about how every leaf is unique and individual. And so what he did is he created this series, Leaves, as memorial art, to memorialize those who had passed. And so what he did for every person he knew who had died of AIDS, he took this thin wire and he created a leaf for them, each one unique. And then he put them on this white paper. You can see on the left a series of them, and on the right, this is an individual framed leaf. And so each time that he knew somebody who died of AIDS, he would create another leaf. And as of now, there are over 250 leaves in the collection. Another example, again, with the rise of identity politics. This is another artwork that's, again, trying to point out the suffering of AIDS and the impact of AIDS. This is by Felix Gonzalez Torres, and what this work is doing, it's called Untitled, or A Portrait of Ross in LA, and this one's from 1991. And when you look at this, what we're looking at is this is actually a pile of individually wrapped candies. And the weight of it is 175 pounds. And that was the weight Ross was when he was healthy. Ross was Gonzalez Torres' partner. And so this was his weight before he contracted HIV and AIDS. And what happens is what you're invited to do is you're supposed to come up and you're actually supposed to take a piece of that candy with you. So what will eventually happen? This represents Ross. Well, as the candy disappears, it's literally representing the disappearance of Ross, how AIDS, how the disease led to the breakdown and eventual complete loss, because eventually this will be completely gone. Also, the idea of the wrappers. Think about when you have those cellophane wrappers on the candy, right? You eat the candy. Where do those cellophane wrappers end up? They end up everywhere. And so that's also exploring and looking at that idea of how easily the AIDS virus can be spread, or HIV virus can be spread. So what we see in this, right, it's this use of minimalism and conception work to address the feelings of loss and longing all brought by AIDS. What's interesting, depending on when you hear this, University of Louisville actually has one of these. I'm recording this in the fall semester of 2024, and Untitled Portrait of Ross is actually on exhibit at the Speed Art Museum. And so you can go there and you can be a part of this, that you can go and literally take a piece of that candy with you and participate in the artwork. And then another artwork that is exploring this idea of humanizing those who are homosexual. What we're looking at here, this is a work by David Wojnarowicz, and it's called One Day This Kid from 1990 to 91. And when we first look at it, right, we look probably at the image of the boy. And he's this young child, right, that he's young, kind of got this hope, this hopefulness and this innocence about him. Yet take a few minutes and read the words that are behind him. And what he's doing in this is he's talking about, here's this young, innocent kid, yet he's going to have to go through all of these things. He's going to suffer all of these things based on his own homosexuality. Part of it says, this kid will lose his constitutional rights against the government's invasion of his privacy. This kid will be faced with electroshock, drugs, and conditioning therapies in lavatories tended by psychologists and research scientists. He will be subject to loss of home, civil rights, jobs, and all conceivable freedoms. And so what he's trying to juxtapose, right, he's trying to definitely humanize this character that we see here, this innocent kid, this innocent boy who should have his whole life in front of him. However, we read about everything he's going to be subjected to in his life because of his sexual orientation. And then the last film I want you to watch, this one is here, and this one is, again, it's a short film, and what they're actually doing in this is they're looking at and comparing the works of Felix Gonzalez Torres and David Wojnarowicz. And what we're going to see in this is it's going to explore another work of Wojnarowicz, which is definitely much more aggressive and much more in your face about the topic. Felix Gonzalez Torres, side note, he also did eventually die from complications of AIDS also. All right, and then the last section we're going to look at is expanding the field today. So why there have been, right, advances and strides in the acceptance and the showing of homosexual queer art in the public sphere, what we see today is, we still have work to do. Because if you think about it, and if you think about all the artworks that we talked about, they have pretty much one thing in common. Most of them are from white men. So why we see there is more acceptance of queer art, it's mainly white gay men, and to a lesser degree white lesbian women that have been seen more in the art world. However, right, queerness, homosexuality is not just for one race, one ethnicity. And what the art world we need to look at and still explore is other representations of other cultures, of other races, of other ethnicity that are also queer. And so while, yes, again, there has been great strides, there still is more to do. And we see that in the work here of Salman Toor, which is titled Four Friends of 2019. And so with this lecture, hopefully you can see how art for all time has addressed issues of homosexuality, transgender, and gender identities, but it hasn't been until after Stonewall that we see more of these works of art being more socially acceptable in public spheres. And again, not to say they are completely acceptable in some areas, because they're not, but we see more of this in the modern culture. However, again, the work is not done, that we also need to see representations of more minority works within the queer art sphere.